Hey, we're finally back. Welcome to Pet Squares, a Geek's Guide to the Beach Boys. I'm your host, Adam Marsland, and we are on part 6 of our 7-part exhaustive examination of the Beach Boys' masterpiece, Pet Sounds. Those of you that are watching in real time know that it's been a good while since the last video. A brief explanation. I put up a number of videos in the run-up to the United States election, and they all pretty much tanked, which made me think I ought to wait a little while before putting up another video. And at that point, I was transferring to a new city and getting established here as a musician. And that's gone quite well. In the last month of November, I played 21 shows, which is a lot. And if you're a professional musician, those are the kind of problems you want, but it left me with very little free time to do videos. And the free time I did have, I needed to rest my voice because I was singing 2 or 3 hours a night for every one of those shows. So you can see how it is that it has taken me a bit to get a new video up. And I knew this would probably be an issue during what's called the high season here where I live in Cambodia. And I was concerned that this would create an issue for some of the patrons, and indeed we have lost a few patrons for the channel. I totally get it, and that's why I haven't been really pushing the Patreon and stuff like that. It's not really right to do that when I'm only putting up a video every month or even every 2 months in this case. All I can tell you is thank you, all of you that have stuck with me, the patrons and the contributions. That really does help getting these videos up. That information is in the comment section, and I can just tell you that I've made a commitment to do this show, and I'm going to keep doing it. There are times when I have to just focus on making a living, practicing my trade, which is a musician, and that's kind of how it's been. But I have a free day here, and I have some daylight to shoot by, so let's get on with it, shall we? With the first song on side 2 of Pet Sounds. And this is a big one. God Only Knows. Certainly one of the Beach Boys' crowning achievements, if not the greatest song that they ever did. There's a lot of competition for that award. But God Only Knows, certainly a nearly universally respected song. It's a standard. It is just a very acclaimed bit of work. Let's start out with the musicians that made this wonderful record. On grand piano with taped strings. They taped the strings inside the piano. Mr. Don Randy, harpsichord, Larry Nichtel. Carol Kay playing the 12-string electric rhythm guitar. On electric bass, Ray Pullman with a little bit of a slapback delay effect on the bass. Upright bass, Lyle Ritz. Hal Blaine playing both sleigh bells and drums. Hal did the sleigh bells for the first part of the song and then switched to drums in real time. On the recording, there was a little bit of consternation on Brian's part whether Hal was going to be able to pull this off, but pull it off he did because he is Hal Blaine, so Hal did double duty on this one. The estimable Terry Melcher on tambourine. Jim Gordon on percussion, that clickety-clack sound that was achieved by playing orange juice cans with sticks. Yes, back in 1966, they had orange juice in cans. 2 accordions once again, as we saw on Wouldn't It Be Nice. Carl Fortina and Frank Morocco, helming the bellows in that case. On flutes, Bill Green and Jim Horn. Clarinet, Jay Migliore. Bass clarinet, Leonard Hartman. French horn, Alan Robinson. And on the string section, violins led up by Sid Sharp, then followed by Leonard Milarski, Daryl Terwilliger, and Jesse Ehrlich. The entire track was amazingly done live, and a lot of the sonic density of the song is achieved by the sound of all of the instruments kind of reflecting in the room, in the studio room. This is something that doesn't happen in modern day recording all that often, unfortunately, in my opinion, because everyone is obsessed with separation, and nowadays actually most of the sounds themselves are computer generated. But back in the day, you had all these guys crammed into a pretty small studio making a pretty great sound, and just the bleed itself of the instruments going into other microphones, as he checks his microphone, became part of the sound, the overall ambience of the recording. But yeah, all done live. There apparently was a sax solo that was tried and wisely discarded. This can be heard on the Pet Sounds box set, the Pet Sounds Sessions box set. You might notice that Carl Wilson is absent from these credits. He was long thought to have played 12-string guitar on this recording. It's now believed by the experts that that I consult with, head up by Craig Selinsky, without whom I could not do most of these shows, and his research team, who I've mentioned many times in the past. It's now believed by those folks that Carl, though he was present at the session along with Bruce Johnston, did not play on the recording itself. It's not 100%, but pretty close. They don't think he was on it now. And apparently, Bruce in particular was very blown away by this session. This is one of the sessions, if not the session, where Bruce felt like he really understood where Brian was finally going with Pet Sounds, and made Bruce an enthusiastic supporter and booster of the record. The song itself, as I said before, one of the Beach Boys' crowning achievements. It's gotten near universal acclaim. Paul McCartney either called it the greatest love song ever written or the greatest song ever written. It's been written both ways. I couldn't reach Paul for comment, but Paul liked it a lot. On Rolling Stone's Greatest Songs of All Time, it's listed at number 11. Number 1 on Pitchfork's Greatest Songs of the 60s. The Rolling Stone poll, it was voted the Beach Boys' best song by a wide margin. Consequence of Sound, number 1 greatest song of all time. Now, chart-wise, there's a big difference between how it was received in the U.S. and in Britain. As I've mentioned before, in the U.S., it was relegated to a B-side of Wouldn't It Be Nice, I believe. And it's understood that part of the reasoning for this was because of the word God being in the title, and that was a bit controversial, particularly in the Bible Belt. It was there was concern that the song wouldn't get airplay, so that's why it was put on the B-side, apparently. It still made number 39 on the charts, so it had its appreciation in the United States. But in the UK, it was a completely different story. It was a massive hit, went to number 2. It was also top 10 in Canada, Norway, and Holland. And this is kind of key in understanding why the Beach Boys are perceived so differently in Europe and especially Britain than they are in the United States. The Beach Boys would begin to struggle after 1966 as the hippie movement and harder rock sounds began to take over in '67. You have people like Jimi Hendrix and Cream, Jefferson Airplane. They became the standard bearers for music moving forward, and it was much harder, less breezy sound. And the Beach Boys had been around for a while. The Beach Boys were the biggest band in America starting in '63. So there was a firm perception in the American culture of the Beach Boys, and the surf and the Cars and the California sound. That was the way the band were thought of, and to a large degree are still thought of. So it was a harder sell to get the American public to think of the Beach Boys as artistes, right? Now, in Britain, it was quite a different story. The band had had a little bit of success leading up to Pet Sounds, but it was the Pet Sounds era that really broke the band huge. Barbara Ann was a massive hit in Britain. Now, obviously not a Pet Sounds track, but we are into '66 now. It was immediately followed by Sloop John B., another massive hit, and they had God Only Knows. And so this was like their third big hit. I believe they had one other top 10 hit. I think I Get Around might have made the top 10. But you can see they didn't have this long history with the British public forming an image of the band as Bruce Johnston later called them surfing Doris Days. So it was much easier for the British to think of the band in an artistic way because Pet Sounds was a huge hit in Britain, and they were a big hit concurrently with everything going on in '66 in Britain, which was kind of the height of swinging London, music changing. And it was all moving towards psychedelia, but British psychedelia was much more softer around the edges and much less harsh and much more whimsical than the American variety. So in the British mind, the Beach Boys and what they were doing fit in quite well with how the British saw music progressing in the late '60s. In America, not so much. And God Only Knows, I think, is the point where you can see that diverge, because it was such a big hit in Britain and paved the way for Good Vibrations. And the band continued to have hits in Britain all the way up to 1970. The band did not slow down as a hit-making machine in the UK until the Sunflower album. So this set up the Beach Boys for a run of success in Europe, where they were unencumbered by the image issues that they had by the long string of Surfin' in Car and breezy, sunshiny hits in America. So the success of God Only Knows is where you see these two paths diverge. Now, as I said before, one of the reasons that God Only Knows may or may not have run into trouble in America was the use of the word God in the title. And when this song was being written, this is a source of some controversy. And Brian initially balked at it. Tony Asher went to bat for having, going there. In fact, Tony Asher had to go to bat for the lyrics in general because it was a little bit of a radical departure from what a love song had been before. The opening lines, I may not always love you. Wow, that's actually a pretty sophisticated lyric for pop music in 1966. Brian eventually came around to Tony Asher's way of thinking. He realized that he might get a little bit of controversy by having the word God in the title, and so they got on the same page, and they came up with this very unusual love song. Now, musically, it's agreed that Brian came up with this song very quickly. Carl has said it was as little as 10 minutes. It's generally agreed that it was about a half an hour, if not less. And we'll be going over the chord progression for God Only Knows in a minute. But it's a very unusual sequence of chords, although like many of the songs in Pet Sounds, if you follow Brian's left hand and his way of thinking about where chords would follow the bass line, it all does make sense. It all fits together if you get the type of choices Brian tends to make as a composer. But that doesn't make it any less radical or any less interesting. And the song is also, like many of the songs on Pet Sounds, features a very prominent bass line played very high up the neck. The most unusual part that in terms of how it departs from Brian's usual standard operating procedure is the staccato bridge. And this was actually Don Randy's idea, Don Randy, the studio keyboardist. The bridge is the hardest part to play. I mean, actually, Darian Sahanaja from Brian's band and I had a little exchange on Facebook recently where this was being discussed, and Darian admitted that even the band, cheated it once in a while, which I was relieved to hear because I also play the song live from time to time, and I'm barely getting through that section. The rest of it's not that hard to play, but trying to get all that going on with just a piano, it's tough. And even the studio musicians struggled with it, and it took 22 takes to get it right. The track itself is a strong quarter note pulse, as Brian likes to use, like dun, 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 dun. And it's the keys and the guitar and the sleigh bells hold down that quarter note action, and then it's offset by the ping pong percussion. And the accordions are especially prominent on the intro. You don't really notice them, but they underpin the whole thing. And it's interesting to hear how, like, the pedaling strings, which you don't really hear the strings so much on the mono version, but on the stereo version, it's more prominent. They add a very subtle development to the second verse, and the flutes come in the third verse. So it's as a pop song, it's arranged in a very nice way where everything's quite subtle, but it maintains a sweet atmosphere and a loving atmosphere. And Brian's talked about wanting Pet Sounds to be a loving kind of experience, okay? And the whole track just has this sort of dreamy, I mean, it's good for you to say, but it does sound loving. I mean, it has a very, the track sort of embraces you, doesn't it? And the way the instruments kind of just, you get the accordions underneath in the beginning, you kind of don't hear them, but you feel them, and then you get the strings in the second verse, and then the flutes, you do notice the flutes, but they're kind of back in the background with a little reverb on them and all that stuff. The way everything develops, it's like you're sitting on a park somewhere having a picnic, and then a breeze comes in from one side, and the sun's going down over here. It just conveys a very sweet, we use that word a lot, but I can't think of another way to put it. A sweet, subtle, gently building atmosphere. which of course leads into the counterpunctual outro with the different voices and the gorgeous sort of counterpunctual action with the vocals that are done by Brian and Bruce. But speaking of loving and sweet, we have not yet discussed the lead vocal, which was done by, of course, Carl Wilson, his signature lead vocal. And people forget, this was pretty early on in Carl's career as a lead vocalist. I can't think of exactly where it comes in the sequence, fourth or fifth, I think, in the number of actual lead vocals he had sung. And of those that he had done previously, there's only a few where he sang the whole song all the way through. So this was a big assignment for Carl. But Brian, you know, we've talked before about Brian had a very innate understanding of his bandmates' vocal capabilities, and he knew that Carl was the man for the job. And Brian, as I had already alluded to, had spoken in depth about the spiritual qualities and the spirit of love he wanted to imbue in the songs with Pet Sounds, and this is something he and Carl in real time had conversations about. So Brian very astutely realized that Carl, not just in terms of the timbre of his voice, but his personality and his thoughtfulness as a vocalist and in his approach to the band's music, would be the right person to carry the message and carry the song. In fact, there was at one point, supposedly Keith Badman, the author of the book, can't think of the name of the book right now, but Keith Badman's book, you all know what I'm talking about, claimed it was at one point supposed to be a Carl solo single. I haven't been able to find any backup of that, and there are quite a few inaccuracies in that book. So I don't know if that is true or not, but it is true that Carl, Bruce, and Brian are the only ones that sing on this recording with, as I said, Bruce prominently featured along with Brian on the outro. The part that goes ba 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 that sounds like Mike is actually Brian doing sort of his Mike imitation. But in terms of directing the vocal for Carl, Brian gave Carl very good advice. He says, don't do anything with it, just sing it real straight, no effort, take a breath, let it go easy. What a great production note. It actually makes me think briefly of a time that I was playing Carl in a tribute band and I sang the song, and someone took me to task for using too much vibrato, and I was sort of imitating Carl's little burr that he does, you know. It's bad Carl, but anyway, you kind of get what I'm trying to say. But you know, thinking back on it, it was actually a good note, because on this particular song, Carl doesn't do that. He just sings it, I may not always love you, right? It's not, I may not, it doesn't do that. And if he did, it would sort of blow the whole song. So the track's perfect, really. I mean, what else can you say? You know, I could spend another 10 minutes talking about the various ways everything comes together, but it came together perfectly, and everybody involved knew what they were doing. It wasn't an accident that this song became the classic it was. There was a lot of thought and intent behind it. So kudos to Brian as a producer, to Carl as a vocalist, to Asher as a lyricist for his very interesting and unique approach to the Eternal Love song, and to the musicians who realized it. Other things to talk about, the background vocals also went through some iterations. There is a busier version of the outro where Brian tried out more singers, and it was actually a lot of people outside the Beach Boys. Terry Melcher sang on it, and Diane and Marilyn Ravel Wilson, his wife. It's a little bit much, a little bit pitchy, and doesn't sound like the Beach Boys. It does sound a bit like Spring, which is the Ravel's the Ravel project that Brian produced as a side effort. So once again, Brian showed a very good production instincts in not using it and paring things back to the emotional essentials of the track. In order to keep things moving, because these videos have gone, you know, quite long, I'm just going to run through the chords of the track as I play them, and I'm also going to give you the chords as Darren Sahanaja has graciously loaned me to look at. They are the Brian Wilson Band's official chords, so there may be some divergence. And it's interesting because I can remember playing this once, and Chris Farmer from the Beach Boys band was there, and he got on my case because I had added a note. Like it wasn't exactly playing the wrong chord. I just added a note that wasn't there, and that's how precise this can get. You know, not just in terms of the chord, but the exact voicings, the exact notes of it. So rather than get into semantic arguments about it, I've played it the way I'm used to playing it, and I'll give you the chords as Darian has them, and then any differences you can work out amongst yourselves. So here we go. So I cheated and didn't play the bridge for reasons already stated. But anyway, other things to talk about with God Only Knows. It could be argued that God Only Knows invented the genre of Baroque pop. I don't know if that is accurate because Baroque pop itself is sort of a retroactive way to talk about a lot of the music, the pop music that came after Pet Sounds, and we talked about this in previous episodes. But if not, it certainly presaged the Baroque pop trend. The song's been used widely in films, in Boogie Nights, and very memorably at the ending of the very popular holiday film Love Actually. Actually, very moving segment at the end of that. I personally love that movie. There's a BBC Music version that was done in 2014 that had a who's who pretty much of artists at the time doing their interpretation of the song. Brian May, Pharrell Williams, and oh my gosh, I can't even think of everybody. And Brian himself is in it playing, I think, To a Tiger, which if it happened in real life would have probably terrified him. But it's quite a beautiful rendering of the song. Other significant cover versions include David Bowie, Taylor Swift, Lyle Lovett, and Neil Diamond. I actually did a version of it with a band called Pacific Soul Limited, and I reimagined it as if Al Green had done it, sort of doing my poor man's Al Green on it. If you're interested in hearing that, you can find it on YouTube, Pacific Soul Limited doing God Only Knows. And yeah, perfect song. Next up, I know there's an answer, and I know this white blob here is a bit distracting. Because I don't want to delay this video any longer. I'm actually filming this in a hotel right before I'm getting ready to move, and it's poorly lit here, so I have to basically shoot this while the sun is up and the sun is going down. So you're going to see this light go up behind me. I'm sorry, this is just how it is. But anyway, back to the topic at hand. Side 1, track 2, I know there's an answer. Fairly notorious track in this album. Before we get into why, let's talk about the musicians. We have on organ, Larry Nichtel, and the man himself, Brian Wilson. Tack, upright piano, Al DeLore. 12-string electric guitars and 12-string Mando guitar, Mr. Barney Kessel. 12-string guitar and banjo overdub, Glenn Campbell. Once again, electric bass, Ray Pullman. Upright bass, Lal Ritz. Tambourines, 2 of them, Hal Blaine and Steve Douglas, who is usually on horns, but there ain't no horns here for him to horn, so he's on tambourine. Timpani, Julius Wechter. Alto flutes, Jim Horn and Paul Horn. Okay, I don't know if they're related. That would be too trippy if they're both called horns, and but anyway, we'll do our usual deep dive into the horns. Okay, whatever that said, that was interesting. Clarinet, Bobby Klein. Bass clarinet, Jay Migliori. Bass harmonica, Tommy Morgan. And this song famously started life as Hang On to Your Ego with lyrics by Terry Satchin, who was the Beach Boys' road manager. The ego thing is an LSD reference that Mike objected to, although originally sang, albeit a bit sarcastically. Mike was later credited with lyric rewrites. Mike was seemingly hip to what the implications of this song were. Some of the other guys, not so much. Al's quoted as saying, "We didn't even know what an ego was," which is, kind of tells you a lot about the difference in where the band was at versus where Brian was at. Bruce never liked this track. This is probably his least favorite track on Pet Sounds. He didn't like it either way. He just felt the song sounded kind of off. And I'm going to get to why I think that might have been in a minute. I think there's an interesting thing about the lyrics here because there's a self-correction in it. Like, because Brian, which is something I like about when Brian's lyrical viewpoint, which is often a little bit odd, but Brian, for such a, this is kind of a negative thing to say. I'm trying to say it objectively. For such a self-absorbed person, in some ways, I don't mean he's that way all along, because he's not. But there's a certain navel-gazing quality to a lot of what Brian thinks about, particularly from this point on in. But he is also fairly self-critical. Brian doesn't fall into the trap of just excusing himself for his own foibles. He's actually at times pretty brutally self-flagellating. And one thing I like about this song is Brian talks about ego, and talking about the original lyrics here, he talks about ego as something that people get hung up on, and being a lifelong musician, and the older I get, and the more I sort of relate to this idea of how much ego can get in the way of art and get in the way of human unity, human togetherness, right? But at the same time, Brian makes this observation, which is probably acid-fueled, but it's still valid. But he also doesn't want to preach, and so he has this interesting line, "How can I come on when I know I'm guilty?" In other words, I'm no better than you. This is one of my foibles as well. I really like that. Like, lyrically, that's really cool. Now, Terry Satchin, of course, is credited as a lyricist, but Pet Sounds generally reflects Brian's thoughts on it. I do think this is coming from Brian. So Mike comes along, rewrites the lyrics, and Mike's point of view is very different. Brian's looking at it from a reflective point of view. He's criticizing humanity, but he's also criticizing himself, and he's talking about how ego gets in the way of people's ability to help one another achieve fuller lives. Well, that's kind of not where Mike's at. Mike's a very self-determined kind of guy. So I know there's an answer, but I have to find it by myself, which contradicts actually where the song opens up. I know so many people that think they can do it alone. They isolate their heads and they stay in their safety zone. And oh boy, do they. Again, that's another very astute statement from Brian, especially for 66. But so you have, it's funny because in Brian and Mike's lyrical collaborations in Beach Boys Today, which I think is where they were most in sync, Mike kind of tuned up Brian's thoughts to make them a little more accessible, but he doesn't really get in the way of what Brian's trying to say. He just kind of tunes it up a bit. Not here. I think there's a definite clash between where Mike wants to take this thought, where Brian wants to make this thought. And so the overall lyrical idea of this song is kind of muddled. So, I'm not saying the song sucks. As I've said before, there's nothing on this album that sucks. But, overall, it does sort of, in an interesting way, kind of get at where Brian's head is going, where Mike's head is going, and the fundamental difference between their two personalities and how this would play out in the future. And I'm going to talk about this in more detail when we get into the later albums, but one of the interesting things about the band is how each individual in the band is in a way sort of an archetype for us to hold on to. Brian, Mike, Dennis, Carl, Al are all quite different individuals with different strengths and weaknesses, but we can recognize them as characters pretty well. Bruce is a little more murky, but I think as we've talked about Bruce in this series, you start to see his deal, which is kind of interesting. So, but the sort of kings of the Beach Boys perceptions, the Mike, the sort of crowd pleaser, detractors would say lowest common denominator type of approach to entertainment, versus Brian's sort of higher, more sensitive, detractors might say mopey, his approach to art. You take either one of them away, the Beach Boys are no longer the mega band that they became, because they somehow managed to hold these multitudes, right? The Mike part, the crowd pleasing part, the hey yippee part, and then the part of that Brian brings to it. He doesn't just write the music and he doesn't just arrange the vocals, all the stuff we know him for, but in terms of what he brings to the vibe of the band, he's the guy that adds the emotional depth. And Mike's more of the surface guy. But you take one or the other away and everything kind of doesn't work. But their ability to coexist in the same band, those vibes are going to get more and more difficult from here on in. And you kind of see that uneasiness in this track, like what's it trying to say? I don't really know. Anyway, so the lead vocal on this is by Mike, Al, and Brian, and they're all kind of hard to tell apart. I mean, before we all knew about this, who was saying what, I remember listening to this and trying to, well, I think that's Al, but no, wait, it sounds like Brian, and it really was Al handing off to Brian, but you're like, why are they changing in the middle of the verse? Why do they sound almost exactly alike? But yeah, this is Al's only lead vocal on the album, and it's quite a minor. You could blink and you miss it, or you could think it was Brian or whatever, but Al does sing lead on part of the song. Carl is also on the backing vocals for this. Dennis and Bruce are apparently absent from it. Al, I guess, had a lot of trouble singing the vocal on this, as brief as it was. Some of the problem was Mike hated the song and apparently was sabotaging the session, and so that made things kind of go poorly. So in terms of the musical elements, the main part of the song is fairly conventional, but then you have this wild, descending, dissonant clarinet session, which is very jazz, and which I started to work out, and I decided it was you'd seen enough of that stuff. But it's very interesting, and then it leads into this very unusual bass harmonica solo with a banjo chugging along, which sounds, you go from this jazz kind of Benny Goodman kind of thing into what sounds like a soundtrack from a Western movie. And again, not for the first time in this album, we have Brian spending a lot of time at home in the lead up to Pet Sounds, and in '65 not doing much but considering ideas for the album, as we discussed previously. And I gotta ask, how many of these arrangement ideas that Brian was having was he getting from just watching TV? Because the interesting thing about this is you have the jazz thing, and as I just said, then you get this part that just sounds like it's from a Disney Western movie, or Davy Crockett or something like that. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this, but I haven't heard anybody really put this out there. But I got, just thinking about how the creative process works and my own experience with it. If Brian was watching a lot of TV, I think he probably picked up, some stuff from TV soundtracks. And Surfer Girl famously started out as a reimagining of When You Wish Upon a Star, which is from a Disney movie. So we have some basis in Brian writing this way. Also, the calliope sound of the organs harkens back to the childhood theme that the album starts out with, which indicates that this song was, some of the musical ideas from this song were conceived in '65, part of the album. This is another song where the backbeat is percussion and there aren't any drums in this one. It's just timpani, bam, on the one, which is unusual. Again, we have the timpani, another hallmark of this album, the timpani being a co-equal, or in this case, taking the place of the drums entirely. So this has taken that primacy of the timpani on Pet Sounds one step further on this song. I personally, I kind of feel Bruce on this tune. I personally dislike the dissonant 1/5 thing of the verse. There's sort of a deliberate wrong note in there, and I think again this goes back to that childhood concept. It does sound like kids playing in a playground, like some of the other bits and pieces of this album do. But I really like the tension of the 5 and the root in the chorus. That's really cool. And there's also a neat little counterpoint melody that's buried in the fade that I really like, and it's more prominent on the stereo version. So I'm not a big fan of this song, mostly because I just dislike the sort of dissonant calliope 1-5. It's a simplistic progression that's further marred for me by the dissonant note that's in there. But I like all the bells and whistles around it, like the parts that aren't that part. They're really cool to me. Personal reflection on this track. I've alluded many times to having taken part in some Pet Sounds tribute shows, and the one I did in 1996 with Wild Honey, they had Tommy Morgan, the actual harmonica player, reprise his solo on this track. And when he went up to play it, we in the choir were mesmerized. We just couldn't believe we were seeing this, right? And we were so in awe of him doing this solo that every single one of us missed our cue when we came back. Because remember, the vocals come in right after the harmonica, and we're just like, we were just like, we couldn't believe it. So that was an amazing moment in my life. Another amazing thing about this song, this song actually played a very pivotal role in my own musical development, but not in the Beach Boys version. In 1993, Frank Black covered the original version of this song. He did a sort of what would you call it? A post-punk, light industrial pop version of Hang On to Your Ego. Frank Black, of course, is Black Francis of the Pixies. And up until that time, I had no understanding or connection to alternative music at all, which was fomenting around me. In fact, I've alluded to this before. At that very time, I was practicing in a garage with Weezer, who were about to become one of the biggest bands in the world, and they had their heads deep in this stuff, and I didn't have any clue. But I didn't get it. I was into what Jellyfish was doing. That's what I wanted to be doing, right? And so Rivers made up a list of albums that he wanted me to listen to help me make these connections, because he was trying to explain to me that, as a Beach Boys fan himself, that the music I liked did connect to this new alternative music that I just didn't understand. And so I can remember, I took a cross-country trip, this is in 1993, and I had all of these tapes that I'd gotten from Rivers and Justin and some other people around the Amherst house, and I deliberately deprived myself of my normal comfort food of Beach Boys and Elton John and old music. And probably it was, there were some new bands that were in that realm, like the Rembrandts, but it was all new bands. And so I was listening to the Replacements and listening to Sonic Youth, and I was like, this is just noise, right? And then the Frank Black album came on, and I heard Hang On to Your Ego, and it was this thunderbolt moment for me. I was just like, oh my God, now I get it. Because just hearing him reimagine Hang On to Your Ego in this new way, in that moment, like a blinding flash, I understood alternative music. And I was not alien music to me at all. It was my music. It was this music had as much to do with who I was individually as the Beach Boys did, or as Elton John did, or any of the people I grew up with. And that was a huge moment for me, because after that, I was able to connect with all this music. I started to write in that vein, and then I got a deal in making music that fused alternative rock with the Beach Boys sound, and had a nice little run and set me up for a career that I'm still kind of working off up to this day. So I sort of owe this all to Frank Black covering this song. So that's kind of cool. Frank Black's version, by the way, might possibly have been inspired by Sonic Youth's 1990 version on the early compilation album Smiles, Vibes, and Harmony. And I didn't realize that Frank Black's version of Hang On to Your Ego had a video. And reviewing it, Tony Asher is very prominently featured in the video over and over and over again, even though he didn't write the lyrics on this song. He wrote the lyrics on practically everything else on Pet Sounds, but not this song. But he got his propers anyway. Sometimes you get credit where you don't deserve it, and you don't get credit where you do deserve it, and that's just how the cookie crumbles. And the last song we're going to cover today is Here Today, and this is an interesting track. We'll do the musicians first, as we have been doing. On tack upright piano, detuned, we have Don Randy and Brian Wilson also on an overdub. Hammond B3 organ, Larry Knechtel. Acoustic rhythm guitar, Mike Deasy. Electric rhythm guitar, Al Casey. 6-string electric bass, Ray Pullman, again with that slapback delay effect that we saw on the previous song. Upright bass, Lyle Ritz. Drums, Nick Martinez, or Martinis? I want it to be Martinis, but it's probably Martinez. Nick Martinis. Now I want a martini. Anyway, according to the gang, he's playing toms, upturned kick drum, ride cymbals, and a snare turned on and off. I assume that means with the snare actually. Snare drums have an actual snare that's attached to the bottom, and if you have it engaged to the drum, it makes one sound, and like the snappy sound. If you have it disengaged, it makes more of a thumpy sound. I assume that's what they mean. Also on kick drum and tambourine, Frank Kapp is playing tambourine with a stick, playing kick drum with foot pedal as one does. He's not kicking it's too bad, right? He should have been kicking the kick drum, but he wasn't. Baritone sax, Jay Migliori and Jack Nimitz. Bass trombones, Gail Martin and Ernie Tech. For this one, Brian did the track before the lyrics, and it created a lot of problems for Tony Asher trying to write to it. Asher may have contributed some melodic ideas to this song, although it should be noted that if the track was already done before Asher wrote lyrics for it, they must have been melodic ideas for the vocal melody and not for the chord progression or anything like that. This is the only track recorded at Sunset Sound. Bruce Botnick, who had quite a career, most notably with the Doors, was the engineer. On this one, all 6 Beach Boys are featured on the track, although possibly not all at exactly the same time, but they're all on it. Mike is on lead vocal, delivering very pessimistic lyrics with authority. And this is a really interesting track because it is crossing the bridge between the adolescent themes of before and the newfound maturity of Pet Sounds. And it does it really well. I mean, I talked a little bit before about on the last track where Mike and Brian's ideas are a little bit in conflict. Here, Mike he's almost like a more grown-up version of the protagonist he's been on previous songs. This also starts the descent into pessimism that marks the backside of this album. I did talk about this when we did our initial overview of Pet Sounds, that there is a sort of a carry-through thematically where the album starts out very innocent and hopeful, and it ends almost literally on the opposite note of someone bemoaning their lost innocence and feeling somewhat despairing. So things start to go downhill lyrically. I don't mean in terms of the quality of lyrics, because I think the lyrics on this are excellent, but things go downhill in terms of the emotional mood of the album at this point. This is a song written around a lead bass line, and this is as good a time as any to show you what that bass line is. Here Today is a great example of how Brian used the bass as a lead instrument on Pet Sounds. In fact, he specifically states that it's a song that he wrote to feature the bass as an instrument in the upper register, an area that it wasn't usually played before. So it starts out with the bass along with the vocal, and when I was working this out, I was thinking about the argument that's sometimes made that Pet Sounds is the first prog rock album. And I said earlier that you could make a stronger argument for Good Vibrations starting that out, because it's sort of the first pop single, at least the first one I can think of, that operates in movements. But when I was working out the top of Here Today, I was really thinking about this, because even though it is only using a limited number of notes, it's really hard to keep track of which is which, because this is the figure. Staccato than that, but I had to play it up here so you could see it. And you think, okay, it's the same figure over and over. It's not, actually, because the first one goes. from this to this all the way through. And then the second one is a little simpler because you're always going to this note. Sorry. But that's like a prog rock bass line. But also you already notice that the main action on the song is on the bass, because the chords on the piano are pretty simple, and I've only partly worked it out, but I think it's just a B minor to A. Right? So you're doing this. Action is on the bass, basically. It's almost more important than the chords that are being played. You can, I don't know if I can do it, but you could sing the whole song over this and not need this, right? Right? Let me see, where's the pick? You will, by the way, absolutely need a pick to play this song. It starts with just a little glance now. Right away you're thinking about romance now. See what I'm saying? It's like, you've already got more of the song than just playing these chords, right? And I probably got the melody wrong, but anyway, you get the idea. And what's also interesting about that is because the bass isn't covering the root, Brian uses the horns, real deep horns. He called them a masculine sound. I think it's trombones, because what's going on in the bottom is he's holding down the A, so which creates this tension with the B being elevated over the A, the B minor. This time is which is really cool because that gives it a sense of drama. But the bass isn't holding down the root, so that he has the horns hold down the root, which happens in a couple of the songs in Pet Sounds. So then, for after this and for a lot of the song, the horns join in with the bass, and again we have one of these descending bass lines that we see throughout the whole album, a lot of times in chromatic half step. This is more of a major scale descent. Here's a semi-chromatic. Then we get this cool staccato thing, which again is over, ooh, I got organ now. And again, I haven't fully worked this out on the keyboard, just partially, but it's mostly just a kind of a horror movie kind of major to a 4 minor, or back and forth from that. And it switches to a couple other chords towards the end, but the action again is all in the bass. We have this cool reverse glissando thing, which must have been fun to play. And then another descending line, semi-chromatic. Love is here, actually mostly chromatic. Today and it's gone. Tomorrow is here and gone. And then we get another one of these arpeggio bass lines that we had in Wouldn't It Be Nice. And again, he ends on a hanging 2, which we've seen again, I think it was in Sloop John B and probably a couple other tunes. And so then we get back into this. Then we get to the bridge, which is amazing, which is this triplet thing. Which, again, this is why you need the pick, because it's, sorry. Right back into this. So, and that's a real drama in that part, and I'm convinced it influenced the arrangement and writing of I Think We're Alone Now, which was a massive hit for Tommy James and the Shondells in the following year. But that is, again, you've got this real simple, very simple for Brian, progression of minor, A, B minor. I don't know how I got onto a brass patch, but it sounds okay to me. Then A, E, A. And what's interesting about this, let me get it to the piano, hang on a second, is so this bass line that's not playing the root, because a normal thing would be ba la 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 la. I can't sing that fast, but anyway, la. That would be normal, right? What he's doing is this. That's the 7 of the minor, so he's playing an A under the B minor triad. That's wild enough, but then he does this thing he's done before, where as the progression drops, he also drops the root. Now he's on the 7 of the A, and what's even wilder about that is with the first note with the A, at least he's dropping to the A, so he's doing a 7. The second chord is an A, so it kind of goes with that. But the G that he drops to, which is the 7 of the A, is dissonant to the hammer-on chord of the E. Got that for a split second. That's wild. So he's got these 7s in the bass that's a little dissonant to the first chord, and carrying it over to the second progression is really dissonant, and it creates this amazing sense of tension. And you can tell actually that with this song, and I think some of the other tunes, that Brian was probably influenced by what he was watching on TV, maybe the soundtracks for horror movies. That's where he might have gotten the idea to use the theremin on I Just Wasn't Made for These Times and Good Vibrations and such. But this is all very kind of horror movie sounding, like the and this kind of progression. And then let's see if I can play this both at the same time. Right? So it's kind of like a creeper in a horror movie. And it makes sense, because if you think about the different ways Brian would have been absorbing sound, he probably was watching a lot of TV and probably going to the movies and probably absorbing all that soundtrack stuff to get new sounds. Anyway, going into other parts of here today, there's a bunch of what we musicians call ringer sections, which is where the part does something unexpected. Now, the whole song is ringer bass lines, one after another, but some of these really interesting things have variations, like the reverse glissando at the beginning of the chorus, where it goes and going into this. On the third one, he does this. And what's really interesting about that is, even though it's a little easier for the bass player to play, he's going from a D to an E. Instead of going back to the 5 like you might expect, he's going da 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 da, which gives you the kind of suspension, of the chord there, the D over an E. And I actually, frankly, don't know that that's what it is, but I'm sure it's something like that, because that's what's being implied. And then when we get to this little arpeggiated figure, at the last time through, it does this. Just as crazy, and but not the same. And so it's one of these things where, when we talk about Pet Sounds and prog rock, okay, maybe it's still pop music, but if you're a bass player, which, I'm a marginal bass player, but I get by. But this stuff is really tricky. And after I worked this out, I felt like I needed to call Bob Lizik and go, hey, man, I feel your pain here. But it's pretty cool. The whole song is all about the bass, no treble. Yeah. So, as I think I said in the bass analysis, to me, this song had very strong commercial potential and could have been a single from the album. And it is a progenitor, in my mind, of the Tommy James hit, I Think We're Alone Now, which had a sort of a similar pulsating single note bass line high up the fretboard, which was a smash hit. I gotta think that I Think We're Alone Now has some roots in here today. Brian liked to say that the trombone sound gave it a masculine touch, and Brian then further offsets the masculinity of the trombones with saxes, which give it a little more smooth. You got that going on there. one thing that's really interesting, Brian's talked a lot about how the different sounds of the instruments combine and create a new sound. And you hear this on the descending line where you have the piano and several other instruments following the same descending bass line. Da, 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 da. And you hear some overtones and in slightly, it's things being slightly detuned in there. I'm not completely sure what instruments are playing that descending line. If I find that out, I'll put it up here. But it's interesting hearing those overtones, and you definitely hear a piano leading that charge, but it's not just a piano, it's this multiple sound, and you would get this later with MIDI when you would start to be able to layer sounds, but this is one of the first times you had that done manually by just taking a melody line or a pattern and combining instruments to form a new sound that you hadn't necessarily heard before. And you can really hear that on this descending bass line. Famously, you do hear studio chatter on the original version of it. It's Bruce Johnston talking with a photographer, I think, about the lens on his camera. It's also interesting that the chorus only has 7 bars. Usually choruses have 8. The song, two people that widely disparate people that have cited the song as an influence are Al Cooper of Blood, Sweat and Tears and other things, and Lemmy of Motorhead. They both thought the song was pretty cool. I've talked about the commercial potential of this song. Bobby V recorded it as a B-side contemporaneously with its release. In, I believe, Britain, there was a guy named Rob Storm, and there's an obscure Sunshine band called the Seftons that did a version of it. But surprisingly, not covered that widely. I had thought I had read somewhere that a British band had covered it and had a big hit with it, but I went down the rabbit hole and I was completely wrong. What we call the Mandela effect, where you think you're sure something happened and it didn't. But what did finally happen is part 6 of Pet Sounds. I think this one's been a little shorter than the previous ones. I know it's been a slog to get through all of them. There's just so much to cover with this record, and I don't want to give it short shrift. But once we get through with discussing this album, I'm going to try to get the episodes back down to a more manageable size, which of course will enable me to edit them quickly and get them up more often. But I want to thank you all for your patience in waiting for this video to come up. I do have notes from Craig Selinsky and his crack research team to work with to get the final part up already, so I'll do it as soon as I can. And as you can see, to paraphrase Elton John, the sun is going down on me. And so I'll end this video here. Thanks so much for watching and supporting Pet Square's Geek's Guide to the Beach Boys. See you soon.